ज्ञानतिमिरन्दस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मीलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। नमो विष्णुपदाय कृष्णपृष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमति भक्तिवेदान्त स्वामी नीति नामिने। नमस्ते सरस्वती देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्य देशधारिणे। Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita was published in 1981 by the BBT. We all know that Srila Prabhupada disappeared in 1977. So in the course of the 4 years, because very little was known about Srila Prabhupada's previous life, sometimes to his personal servants, Prabhupada would give a little glimpse of his childhood and his struggles before he came to America, but very little was known. So within those 4 years, after in 1978 at the GBC meeting, February, March of that year, because it was just November, December, January, February, 3 or 4 months, the society was in great turmoil, in great suffering due to the loss of Srila Prabhupada, his disappearance. And it was at that time that the GBC decided, there were only 12 GBC at that time, that Satsvarup Maharaj should compile a biography. Now, in order to compile a biography, it's not like translation work that Srila Prabhupada was doing, where you take the slokas and you give your purport. Where do you start with the biography? You have to have the history, the oral history. So oral history, just as before 5,000 years, the Vedas were just spoken from Guru to Shishya. So now we have a vacuum. We don't have Srila Prabhupada to ask, Srila Prabhupada, what did you do in your life? No, we only have the bits and pieces that were collected like jewels from all of the disciples and all of the previous associates of Srila Prabhupada. That all had to be put together like a beautiful masterpiece, an artistic painting of who actually is Srila Prabhupada and what did he do in his life. So Satsvarup Maharaj, he made his camp in Gita Nagari. Gita Nagari was where Prabhupada was headed on his last trip, because Prabhupada wanted to establish in Gita Nagari the ideal self-sufficient community for the entire society to follow. So when he was here in August and he decided, no, I'm going. I want to see my disciples. I want to continue with the translating. Although Prabhupada couldn't walk, he hadn't eaten for months. He lied down on the back of an ambassador car. They took him to the airport. He flew to London with great expectations that he would then go to New York and then go to Gita Nagari, to New Vrindavan. He had so many plans to continue his preaching to enthuse his disciples. But he only got as far as London, and then he had to come back. So Satsvarup Maharaj, there he was in Gita Nagari, and he started to send disciples, of course, disciples of Srila Prabhupada at that time, because there was no real initiation going on immediately. He was sending them all over the world to interview the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. So within those 4 years, as many disciples as possible that he could locate, his assistants, they interviewed us. And all of that was taken back. In those days, we only had cassette tapes. So some people, I did 1 cassette tape. Jamuna did 14 cassette tapes, depending upon all the amount of association that each one of us had. And in that way, all of those tapes were sent to Gita Nagari. They were transcribed by his assistants. And then he would read them all of those memoirs. And we would get the memoirs back, where he underlined what he felt was important, and then he wanted more information. It was a huge task to do within 4 years. So after compiling this, then, because when you're writing something, you'll do an introduction, you'll do a preface, you'll do a foreword, and you'll also do an invocation, according to Shastric, whatever you author in Shastric literature, you invoke the blessings, and you also give benedictions to your readers. So Satsvarup Maharaj, he wanted to do everything perfectly in the presentation of this Prabhupada Lilamrita. And he started, it turns out, as I was researching this, every publication of the Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita is slightly different. Sometimes they put the foreword, sometimes they put the introduction, sometimes they put the invocation, and sometimes they put nothing. And they just start with chapter 1. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to collect everything that was in the original presentation given by Satsvarup Maharaj and begin the way he wanted it begun. Now, possibly, the foreword was added afterwards, because the foreword is written by one of the most prominent, foremost scholars in America. He was in charge of the Department of Divinity at Harvard College. So in this particular edition, we have his foreword. His name is Harvey Cox. And he was a very far-sighted Christian. He appreciated Prabhupada immensely. He actually compared him to the prophet of the Christians, Jesus Christ. Because in Christianity, there is someone sent by the Supreme Lord. They have different names for the Supreme Lord. And that person is considered a prophet or a Messiah who is able to uplift the entire world. And Harvey Cox compares Srila Prabhupada to Jesus Christ in that way. Because in such a short amount of time, having been sent directly by the Supreme Lord, he was able to have such a massive impact on the entire world. And he will, as we read this foreword, we'll understand how the top professor in America of divinity compares Srila Prabhupada to a Messiah coming from the Supreme Lord. So at the very beginning of the Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita is a sloka coming from the Adi Purana, and it's also repeated by Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. So we can chant that sloka together. Ye me bhakta jana partha, na me bhaktascha te janaha, mad bhaktanam cha ye bhaktas, te me bhaktat tama mataha. Ye me bhakta jana partha, na me bhaktascha te janaha, mad bhaktanam cha ye bhaktas, te me bhaktat tama mataha. Ye me bhakta jana partha, bhaktascha te janaha madbhaktanam cha ye bhaktas te me bhaktatamamataha ye me bhakta jana partha name bhaktascha te janaha madbhaktanam cha te bhaktas Yene bhakta tamamataha. Matajis? Yene bhakta chanapata. Name bhaktascha te janaha. Madbhaktanam cha ye bhaktas. Yene bhakta tamamataha. Yene bhakta janapata. Name bhaktascha chetana. Madbhaktanam cha neya bhaktas. Yene bhakta tamamataha. I can't see the word for word. I'm just going to read the translation. I'm sorry. Lord Krishna told Arjuna, those who are directly my devotees are actually not my devotees. But those who are devotees of my servant are factually my devotees. We can repeat. Lord Krishna told Arjuna, those who are directly my devotees are actually not my devotees. But those who are devotees of my servant are factually my devotees. I also can't read I don't have a... We'll just begin now with the... I'm sorry, I don't have a copy of this Chaitanya Charitamrita.
So it's different.
It's just one sentence. Okay. Can you read it? You can all read it. Okay, fine. So now we're going to go to the foreword written by Dr. Harvey Cox. It is a distinct and unusual honor for me to be asked to write a foreword to this eloquent and informative biography of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. To my great regret, I never met him during his sojourn here in America. So his appreciation was only by meeting the disciples and by seeing the work that Srila Prabhupada had accomplished in America. But I feel that I have met him. The spiritual reality of a great teacher lives on in many ways, not the least in the lives of those he has touched. Since I have come to know many of Srila Prabhupada's disciples over the past years, as well as many devotees who were influenced by him, without knowing him personally, I sense a certain acquaintanceship. Now, this is very important for all of the devotees who never personally had association with Srila Prabhupada. Because someone may ask, how can we really understand Srila Prabhupada and his teachings if we never even met him? And Prabhupada, he responded to that. He, just like when you're studying medicine, you have the textbooks. In most cases, you'll never meet the author of that textbook, but you'll get the information. And you can personally become a doctor by studying the teachings of an expert doctor. And you also need practical. There's the literature, and then there's the practical. So that practical comes from association with devotees who might have had association with Srila Prabhupada or who are following strictly the teachings in his books. So although Dr. Harvey Cox never met Srila Prabhupada, he was so impressed by his teachings, by his works, and most prominently, by the followers that he met. The 50th anniversary of ISKCON, which is just a short time ago, they had a huge conference at Harvard University where so many scholars and leaders of other religious sects came and glorified Srila Prabhupada, because the orthodox nature of religion is now shifting. People are now realizing that the core of religion is the same. It might be called differently. We call it bhakti. They call it the path of devotion, which is how we would translate bhakti. But finally, through interfaith conferences and meetings of the different religious leaders, those leaders are coming to the conclusion that there's one core belief in every religion, and that is love of God. So this is what Professor Harvey Cox appreciated about Prabhupada and his followers and his teachings. To write this forward seems then, in some measures, like introducing a friend. Although it is not true to say in all cases that a religious movement is the shadow of a great teacher. Now this is where Dr. Harvey Cox, because when Srila Prabhupada first came to America, many people stamped the Hare Krishnas and Srila Prabhupada as cultists and a cult leader. That here was just someone who came, had his own teachings, and all of these people were following him as a cult personality. No, it is not true to say in all cases that a religious movement is the shadow of a great teacher. That's not true. Still, there is some measure of truth even in that familiar statement. Why is that? Because when one is following the teachings perfectly, as a perfect example, then naturally everyone will want to follow that person. And there was another professor, his name was Larry Shin. He couldn't understand, when he met the devotees, he saw that they were so sincere, but he couldn't figure out what philosophy they were following, because the devotees themselves had very little basis of the philosophy in the early days. But then when Dr. Larry Shin met Srila Prabhupada, it all fit together. Because Prabhupada's disciples were so devoted to Srila Prabhupada that even though not fully understanding the philosophy of Vaishnavism, they were following him and they'd given their whole life to him. So that's the two things are there. The achar and the vichar. The philosophy and practice of the philosophy. Okay. It will surely help readers of this book to understand ISKCON better, to know the man who founded it, and to be aware of the soil from which he comes. The patience and care with which the author of this volume has reconstructed the long life Srila Prabhupada had already lived, even before he set forth for America, makes for absorbing and inspiring reading. Now, because there was only a 4-year time frame, the research could not be as complete as it would be in later years, because we all wanted this book. We cherished this book when it came out, as much as we cherished Bhagavad-Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. Later, time was taken by other disciples to interview the personal associates of Srila Prabhupada when he was a member of the Gaudiya Math, and other people who lived and worked with Srila Prabhupada, And many, many other books now have been written about Srila Prabhupada since this book. Now that we have a library, these books are all available in the library. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we have now available, because after we go through this, it's endless, the many books that have been written. Govinda Dasi wrote her Prabhupada stories from 1967 and 68. Tamal Krishna Maharaj wrote about 4 books, Servant of the Servant, Final Days, and we'll come to other ones. Veda Vyas Das, he wrote about Prabhupada in Germany. One Mataji Mahamaya, she wrote about Srila Prabhupada. Kurma Das wrote about Prabhupada's adventures in Australia. Shama Sundar, the astrologer, wrote about the horoscope of Srila Prabhupada. Hari Suri wrote his Transcendental Diaries, 6 big volumes. All of those are in the library to read. Shruta Kirti wrote What is the Difficulty? Previously that was called Prabhupada Uvacha. Mukunda Das Goswami, he wrote Miracle on 2nd Avenue. And today, in other parts of the world, I got a message today from New Zealand. Mukunda Goswami is there in New Zealand. Today is his 80th birthday, and they're celebrating it there. He's such a humble devotee, and he is the senior-most of all of the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. He was the first in so many different ways. And his book is so interesting, Miracle on 2nd Avenue. Chasing Rhinos with the Swami by Shyam Sundar in 3 volumes. Guru Das, by his example. Bhakti Charu Swami, Ocean of Mercy. We have the history of our temple here. Acharya by Shesha Das. Ridha, he wrote Destination South Africa, how Prabhupada opened up South Africa. Bhakti Vikas Swami, Jai Srila Prabhupada, and also My Memories of Srila Prabhupada. Another very interesting book that we hardly ever see is called Journey to the Pacific Rim. Because very early, Srila Prabhupada sent one of his disciples, Bali Mardan, to Japan, Hong Kong, and all of the areas on the Pacific Rim, and how he started Krishna consciousness there and brought Prabhupada there. Janananda Goswami, how Prabhupada came to Malaysia. Ridha Das, Mission in Service to His Divine Grace, again in South Africa. Burijan, My Glorious Master. And then we have Prabhupada at Radha Damodar. And the addendum to the Prabhupada Lilamrita is a book called Prabhupada Nectar. And these were anecdotes that he didn't put into the Lilamrita, but are very instructive just by reading these stories. So after this Prabhupada Lilamrita, it's like a nuclear reaction. All of the devotees who had association with Prabhupada then began to write their books. So, I read it, I confess, not just because of my own interest in Srila Prabhupada, but because of the milieu the author recreates, tells us so much more than a mere life story could. It reminds us of how very ensconced Srila Prabhupada was in one of the oldest religious traditions in the world. It recalls how very much went on in the generations, centuries, and even millennia before him that seemed to be gathered and focused in his life and in his teachings. Now this is where Dr. Harvey Cox separates from Prabhupada as just being a cult leader with his own philosophy. Because what Srila Prabhupada did was, he represented the entire Vedic teachings in one person and brought them for the first time to the Western countries. It wasn't Prabhupada's invention of the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. He was simply representing the age-old, the eternal Sanatana Dharma that was found in the Vedas. In one sense, Srila Prabhupada was not at all original, and reading the story of his life raises questions about our typical Western proclivity to attach such value to originality. Now here we have, as what Prabhupada describes, the Munis. Every Muni has to have his own original idea. So it wasn't that Prabhupada was attaching, or any of his followers were attaching his originality. No, what they were attracted to was the sanatan, the eternal nature of his teachings. What the book makes clear, on the contrary, is that Srila Prabhupada is a man who incarnates an ancient tradition. The opening verses of the 4th chapter of Bhagavad-Gita, the Indian text most precious to ISKCON, teach that the ageless science of bhakti-yoga, what Christians might call the devotional path to God, is always received by what the Indians call parampara. Now we know the first verses of the 4th chapter, Imam Paramparam Proktam, how this message has been passed down for millions of years when Krishna first spoke to the sun god. That is, it is passed from one teacher to the next in a living chain, from ancient times to the present. So this is very important. Living chain. So this completely debunks that Srila Prabhupada is the only spiritual master. It must be a living chain. And that's understood even by those who are in other religious doctrines. There has to be a living chain of teachers to set example of the teachings. Srila Prabhupada is best understood as this book presents him as one particularly effective link in this chain. Yet it must be added, Srila Prabhupada was also a unique person. To say that the teachings of the ancient ones comes to us through a series of teachers does not mean that the teachers themselves are interchangeable. This we're learning also when we heard about Srila Madhavendra Puri, and when we see how Srila Prabhupada, he took the teachings such as Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and the Bhagavad-Gita and all of his translations, and he molded them according to his audience, what they could understand and what their level of, what their capacity was to follow. Because even in the very beginning, Prabhupada told the devotees, if I told you all the rules and regulations, you would faint. And when the devotees they asked Prabhupada, should we follow things according to Manu Samhita? And Prabhupada explained, he said, according to Manu Samhita, you're omleches, and you're not even qualified to follow Manu Samhita. So how can you follow it? So Srila Prabhupada, he took those teachings, and according to his unique personality, he adjusted them according to time and circumstance. If they were so faceless, there would be little point in writing a biography of any of them. Now, for instance, in Buddhism, the bodhisattvas, they are all coming down from nirvana. They give the same teachings. It's always the same thing, and then they go back, and then they come again, and they get reborn. So this is the faceless teachings of some different doctrines. It doesn't matter who the bodhisattva is, it's always the same teachings. But it's not like that in Vaishnavism, because we know that every single living entity has a distinct personality and a distinct relationship with Krishna. So they will present the philosophy according to their rasa with Krishna. And that's exactly what Srila Prabhupada did. His personality is shown in all of his books, although the same teachings are coming through Srila Prabhupada. But this life of Srila Prabhupada is pointed proof that one can be a transmitter of truth and still be a vital and singular person, even in a sense I now feel safe to use, in some ways, original. Like when Prabhupada had his first love feast. Mukunda, he talks about the love feast. When Prabhupada, he was just in the loft at that time, and he had about 20 people coming. They wanted to learn Sanskrit. They wanted to just jam with their jazz instruments with Prabhupada. They would all bring their instruments and do kirtan with Prabhupada. And then one evening, Prabhupada announced, "You all come this Sunday to a love feast." And they were shocked because for a Westerner, a love feast means breaking all the four regulative principles. So they were thinking, now what does this old man have to do with the love feast? So they came a little, not knowing what was going to happen at this love feast. But Prabhupada was so cordial, and he had made so many preparations, and he was feeding everyone. It was just like a buffet dinner, and he was being so friendly to everyone. That was Prabhupada's love feast. That was the way he began the distribution of prasadam. So this was his originality. Because who would ever, you never read about love feasts in the Vedas, but this was the way Prabhupada introduced the philosophy according to his audience. Yes. Srila Prabhupada lived during a particularly critical period in Indian history, that of British colonial rule and its aftermath. He worked with and among dozens of people who befriended, opposed, supported, or ignored him. So during the British colonial rule, this was begun by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, because the British, they were out to completely decimate the Vedic culture. And everything that was English was superior. And everything that was Indian was inferior. We were with Prabhupada one morning in Mayapur, and Prabhupada was talking about how they were indoctrinated into this. Medicine, because he was in the medicine field. He said that Nehru, he only took allopathic medicine. He wouldn't take any Deshi medicines because it was superior. Everything was superior. So in big letters, they would write, "Made in England," or "Made in Germany," and that's what people would buy. And then in very small letters, they would write something about India, So this was the propaganda of the colonialists, that reject your culture. It's backwards, it's native, it has nothing to do with progress, and you accept the Western culture. So then Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he tried to synthesize the two. And finally, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he started to use cars. He started to he learned how to do this yukta vairagya. And then Prabhupada perfected that by using everything in Krishna's service. So Harvey Cox, he saw that although Prabhupada was a product of the colonial rule and its aftermath, he was able to come out of that mind frame. Some people criticized Prabhupada, some people opposed Prabhupada, some people supported him, and some people ignored him. And Prabhupada, he used to write to all the politicians, to Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, and he would write to Bahadur Lal Shastri, and he would challenge them that you give me an opportunity and I can change the whole country if you would just follow the teachings of Bhagavad-Gita purely. So of course Mahatma Gandhi, he ignored that. But Bahadur Lal Shastri, he gave Prabhupada an opportunity. He said, all right, you start with the lowest of mankind. You go to Tihar jail and you give classes there and see if you can change any of them. And Prabhupada used to do that. He took up that challenge. So in that way, some people ignored Prabhupada, some people actually encouraged him. He initiated Back to Godhead magazine at what almost anyone would consider a very advanced age, at the age of 70, when most people would be resting on their laurels. He hearkened to the mandate of his own spiritual teacher. Now, this is very high English. Hearken to the mandate. That means he followed the instructions of his spiritual master. And set out on the difficult and demanding voyage to America. Srila Prabhupada is, of course, only one of thousands of teachers. Now, this was when Srila Prabhupada came to America, he had a very envious godbrother who had also been sent to London by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, and he came back unsuccessful. Nothing. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was flooding him with money and everything he could to support him. He couldn't have any success. But when Prabhupada went to America, a whole revolution started. So this godbrother, out of envy, he then came to America not to preach. He came to tell all of us, Prabhupada's disciples, that Prabhupada was not authorized to be a guru. And they should accept him as the guru and reject Srila Prabhupada. Because it says here, Prabhupada is, of course, only one of thousands of teachers. So we only knew Srila Prabhupada. No other teachers had taken the effort to come to America and teach us anything about Krishna. We had never heard of Krishna before until Srila Prabhupada came, and out of his causeless mercy, spoon-fed us the philosophy. So yes, there might have been thousands of teachers, but there was only one teacher in America, and that was Srila Prabhupada. And because he was able to turn our life completely from the most sinful wretches to saintly devotees, or trying to be, we had complete faith in him. So Srila Prabhupada, when this godbrother came and was preaching to us like this, Prabhupada wrote a letter to all of maybe there were 15 temples at the time. He said, he's allowed to visit, but do not invite him to give lectures. And that shut him down completely because no one was going to accept what he was telling us. So then he went back to India. But in another sense, he is one in 1,000, maybe 1 in 1,000,000. This is what Harvey Cox says. As a Christian, it is very important and impressive to me that Srila Prabhupada took it upon himself to bring the teaching he so well represents to America. This sentence, I am sure, requires some explanation. Yes, we were given an example when we first began in the early days of Krishna consciousness. That, Srila Prabhupada, his English was impeccable. That's how he was able to make so many translations. And his English was Victorian from the 19th century, because that was when he grew up, in the early 1900s. And he was taught by Scottish teachers. So his English was higher than the English that we spoke in America. There are different types of English. So we could hardly even understand his English. He was so scholarly. But the example given was, imagine if a Christian goes to India and tries to preach Christianity, but doesn't know any of the Indian languages. How much success could he have? Very little, right? He might be a perfect Christian, but if you can't speak to people, then you're not going to be able to give the message. So Srila Prabhupada, by Krishna's arrangement, was perfectly trained to carry out this order of his spiritual master. Because his mother used to have to hire someone to drag him to school every day. But then after his mother disappeared, he was only 14 years old at the time, his father made sure that he got the best education possible. And of course, in those days, that meant English education, because that was the propaganda. So therefore, Prabhupada, he knew Sanskrit, Bengali, and English. And that was enough so that he could do the translations and he could preach in English perfectly. So he was ready. First of all, as a Christian, I come from a tradition in which God's sending of someone to bring a vital message to those who desperately need it is held in very high esteem. Because as Christians, the barbarians, God sent Jesus Christ. And of course, Jesus Christ, although he had a very short life, he was able to have such an impact by sending his disciples to preach. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, because Jesus was Hebrew, he was Jewish, but the Jewish people didn't accept him, so they made another religious movement, the Christian movement, the followers of Christ. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, Yahweh sends prophets to remind the people how far they have strayed from his will, to expose the way they have misused the poor and failed to defend the widow and the fatherless. Because there are two Bibles. There's the Old Testament and there's the New Testament. Now, most people in India don't know about the Old Testament. The Old Testament, it was given by God, all of the rules and regulations that should be followed by human beings. It's very similar to all the rules and regulations that you find in the Vedas because it's the same God. He just spoke it in a different language. And the histories in that time, how the followers of God went through so many tribulations. Now, this all links. This is a very interesting aspect because we know that the Yadavas, the Yadus, that was the family that Sri Krishna chose to appear in here in India. And we also know that the Yadus, they went, at that time, before 5,000 years, there was one emperor of the whole world. And there were kings who were all over the world who were following the emperor here in India, in Hastinapur. So some historians had a theory that there's one religion, the Jews. They say that the Jews were actually Yadus, who were enslaved in Egypt, where the pharaohs were. So they asked Srila Prabhupada this. And Prabhupada said, yes, that might be true, that actually they are the burnt out remnants of the Yadu dynasty. Because after Krishna left the planet, the Yavanas, the Mlechas, and the European countries, the culture was lost because of the entrance of Kali Yuga. So, but then Prabhupada explains that the Supreme Lord can appear in any family, just like sandalwood. It's called Malaya sandalwood because previously sandalwood you could find prominently in the Malaya hills, Nilgiri and things like that. But sandalwood, it can grow anywhere. And the Supreme Lord also, he can appear in any family he wishes to appear. So although there is a connection between the Jews and the Yadus, it doesn't mean that they're in any way superior, because the Lord can appear in any family that he wishes to appear. So, because this is being spoken by a Christian who comes from the Jewish tradition, And that Jewish tradition originally comes from the Yadus. So this is where the link is, Vedically. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, Yahweh, that's what they call God, although the Jews aren't allowed to say the name of God. It's so sacred. But the Christians call him Yahweh or Jehovah. Yahweh sends prophets to remind the people. What time is it? 10 more minutes? Okay. How far they have strayed from his will, to expose the way they have misused the poor and failed to defend the widow and the fatherless. That's the widows and the orphans. So in all of the scriptures, the Quran, the Vedas, and the Bible, there are rules how you can't mistreat the orphans and the widows. But that wasn't being followed anymore. In the New Testament, that's the second Bible, the New Bible, Jesus sends forth his disciples 2 by 2. He would send them in pairs, asking them to take along only the scantiest clothing and equipment, just like sannyasis. He would send them like sannyasis, telling them to bear the message of peace and salvation to the uttermost parts of the earth. So this was the preaching mission, just as we have in our ISKCON. This preaching mission is also very much prominent in the Christian missionaries. They go all over the world. They go to Africa. They go to the jungles in South America. And they try to give people the teachings of Jesus Christ, just as we try to give people the teachings of Lord Chaitanya and the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. God himself is depicted as sending his only son into the world on a mission that would ultimately cost him his life. So this is the way the Christians see Jesus Christ, that God only had one son. We know that God had millions of sons because he had 16,108 wives. With each wife he had 10 sons. So we know it's a little different, but for them, that one son was enough to give them salvation, Jesus Christ. God himself, yes, Christians are taught to respect and admire those who are willing to pay the heavy price of leaving comfort and security behind to go somewhere else to carry a message of liberation. So that's exactly what Srila Prabhupada did. As soon as his disciples proved their devotion to him, he would send them away. He would send them to different countries to preach. Sometimes all alone, sometimes a husband and wife. For instance, Prabhupada sent Burijan to Hong Kong, and then he sent a wife for him that was Jagatarini. He sent Hridayananda Maharaj all alone to conquer all of South America, and he did it. He made temples all over South America. He sent 3 Grihastha couples to England to start these centers in London. And from there, he also sent one disciple, Shivananda, to Germany. He sent a disciple to France. He sent disciples to Malaysia. We hear the story that Gopal tells how he went to Indonesia for Srila Prabhupada and Japan. He sent disciples to Australia. So this is respected amongst the religions. If one is willing to give up the comforts and security of their life to preach the message of bhakti or devotion. Today, however, many Christians have become comfortable and complacent. This is also happening in our society, right? Not only unwilling themselves to engage in such hardship, but often unable even to understand or appreciate those who do. It is a great loss. Even though some people claim it is a good thing that many Christians are no longer as interested in carrying their message to other parts of the world, that they have become less presumptuous or arrogant, I personally believe It has more to do with sloth. Sloth means laziness. Some people say, yes, these missionaries, they push the Christianity by force onto people, these innocent people. But actually what Harvey Cox is saying, that no, is the laziness of the other people. They just don't want to preach the message of Godhead anymore. And the satiety of consumer society. Now they have a comfortable place, you know, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. It's the same thing in all religions. They practice their dharma, they get some artha, then they get some sense gratification, and that's as far as it goes. The liberation part, they're not interested. Because of satiety, that means they're satisfied in the consumer society. So they only go as far as dharma, artha, and kama. And the preachers who preach liberation, they criticize them. That no, you're just forcing this philosophy onto others. The satiety of consumer society, then with humility. I have little patience with zealous proselytizing, no matter who inflicts it on whom. So Harvey Cox was not a proselytizer. I do believe, however, that any spiritual teaching worth following is also worth sharing. When I visited India, living in fact in the very place where Srila Prabhupada's tradition is centered, Vrindavan, so Harvey Cox came here, I was thankfully received by everyone there, including the sages and holy men, and was asked to share my tradition with them. I spoke to them as a Christian about what Jesus Christ means to me and about what his teaching has to offer to the world. They listened attentively and gratefully. Their only complaint, as I recall, was that I had not spoken long enough. So this is the openness of the Vaishnavas. Just like the swans, they can take milk from water. So the Vaishnavas, they can appreciate, and Prabhupada would say, you don't have to give up your Christianity, you don't have to give up Islam, you don't have to give up your religion. Just follow it. So, Indians, unlike Americans, seem in no hurry to rush off to something else if there is a serious spiritual discussion to be followed. So we'll end here. This is a serious spiritual discussion we're having. We'll have to wait till next Sunday to hear the next episodes in Srila Prabhupada's life. Hare Krishna. Jai.